Welcome back to the show. You know, for years I've read a fascinating columnist in the Asia Times, but he didn't sign his real name. He signed it Spengler. I had no idea who this mystery man was until he revealed himself, David Goldman, who I now watch on clips opining on matters of high finance. He finally joins us now on the Sun News Network for his debut appearance. David Goldman joins me from New York. Welcome, Mr. Goldman.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here. I regard you as a man who looks at politics and the major trends and has a deep economic and demographic and cultural layer of understanding. Let's talk for a bit about how you started writing. Why did you write for years under a pen name? What were the advantages for you of writing anonymously in the Asia Times?
Well, the big advantage would be not getting fired from jobs on Wall Street, where I ran major research groups, first for Credit Suisse and then for Bank of America. Wall Street employers tend not to like controversy, and it wouldn't be fair to employers to associate them with some very controversial things I was writing, so best kept separate. Once I left Wall Street, I fessed up and came out under my real name.
Now, you write, I see you on TV as a commentator, and you tell me about the other places you write and why you choose these different venues. What do you like to talk about? I mean, I know you talking about the great issues. You remind me in some ways of Mark Stein, the rise and fall of civilizations. Where do you write, and why do you write there?
Well, that's a very complimentary comparison. Mark Stein is a terrific writer. I admire him very much. Well, at the moment, I've got a blog at Pajamas Media. That's one of perhaps the leading conservative internet site in the United States. We have other bloggers like Victor Davis Hanson, Claudia Rosette, Ron Radish. So that's a very strong lineup that I'm proud to be part of. And I write for a Jewish webzine called The Tablet. I write more about cultural matters, some politics and foreign affairs, and I do that because as an observant Jew, I'm very eager to be able to address the Jewish audience in particular.
We'll get back to that, I hope, in the two segments we have, but I'd like to come back to your real forte, which is figuring out where capitalism and the world's economy is going. I see that capitalism is in crisis. I think that's obvious. Look at what's happening in Europe, in Greece in particular. Look at America, the downgrading in the quality of its debt. Is it a crisis in capitalism and the free market itself, or is it a crisis in the way we've hyper-regulated it and structured it? What's the problem with capitalism today?
Well, markets basically are a way for one generation to lend money to another. They work well when old people who need savings to live off lend to young people who want to start businesses and buy homes and start families. Now, what would happen hypothetically to a market where every single person retired on the same day? They could all own bonds, which up to that minute seemed perfectly solid, but if they all retired at once and nobody was working, the system would go bankrupt instantly. Now, flash forward to a place like Italy or Greece or Spain, roughly 60% of the people of Southern Europe are going to be retirees by the middle of the century. So it's not everybody retiring on the same day, but many too many people retired because these are countries that simply fail to have children, unlike the United States and Canada, which at least are reproducing themselves. These are countries with an average of 1.3 kids, so they're aging very quickly. Their workforce is diminishing. Of course they're going to go bankrupt. That's not a market problem per se. That's a problem that there simply aren't the people there to meet the obligations in the future. We have market structural problems, but I think it's important to step back and remember that 2/3 of the people who live on this planet live in places where there's very strong economic growth. We happen to have a lot of GDP concentrated in places where there's weak economic growth or even negative growth, like Europe. But I'm not pessimistic about the world economy. I'm just real pessimistic about places like Greece and Italy and Cairo, Illinois.
Well, let's talk about China. I mean, China is the big story, I think, in the conventional media narrative, but I look at China as a country that has forcibly aborted hundreds of millions of its own children. And demographically, do you think, Mr. Goldman, that China will get old before it gets rich? Is China already past its peak economically?
China is a very odd kind of case because it's an enormous country. It's true their labor force is going to shrink in about 15 years, unless, of course, they correct this unspeakable and cruel one-child policy to which you referred. It's a country which has done many terrible things, but many great things. But the thing that I think has to be kept in mind about China is that there is a generation coming into the labor force that is better trained, smarter, and more ambitious than any group of people who ever turned up in one place in all of world history. Here's just one number. You have 50 million Chinese young people studying Western classical music, 35 million pianists alone. This isn't sponsored by the state. Their parents go out and buy them the instrument and pay for the lessons out of their own meager salaries because they know it'll make them smarter in school. The number of incredibly smart people, entrepreneurial, ambitious people coming out of China is extraordinary. And even if they have many demographic problems, many of these apply to very backward areas of the country which are being hollowed out. I don't think China is peaked by any means. And we can't just sit back and wait for them to decline. We're going to have to engage them as a major player in the world with all their warts.
Well, let me ask you this about China. I mean, we see the trappings of a first world entrepreneurial society, and I believe the statistics that you put forward about the number of Chinese students studying music or English or math or engineering. But how far can China go in terms of competitiveness and challenging North America and even Europe if they don't have the political and other freedoms that are actually the foundation of the West? To me, it's almost like a Potemkin village. They may have their cell phones that they're texting. They may have, they may be learning by rote in a school. But if they're not allowed to be critics, to self-criticize, to criticize the order of things, whether it's business or the state, can China ever be successful while it's also a one-party state that does not allow dissent?
It's the strangest hybrid, the economic equivalent of a duck-billed platypus that we've ever seen, which is a capitalist economy sponsored by a communist party. Now, how long can that tension last? You know, I really don't know the answer to that, but I believe that increasingly the Communist Party will have to allow enormous amounts of freedom at the grassroots level to make economic decisions. And if they suppress that freedom, of course, they're going to go down the drain. But there are changes underway which are extraordinary. For example, 10% of Chinese now consider themselves to be Christians. How exactly what the content of that evangelization is something that we'll find out later. But the fastest rate of evangelization that ever occurred in history is now happening in China, and it's mostly oriented towards Anglo-Saxon denominations, partly because of their association with Anglo-Saxon freedom. So there are changes going on in the grassroots of Chinese society which are spectacularly positive, even inspiring, at the same time that there are things going on at the top which, as you point out, are disturbing and sometimes even repulsive.
David Goldman, I did not expect such an optimistic conversation with you. Don't go away, folks. When we come back, I'm going to ask Mr. Goldman about the Occupy Wall Street movement and Ron Paul. That's next on The Source. Welcome back to The Source. We're talking with David Goldman, a.k.a. Spengler, who joins us from New York. Mr. Goldman, what do you make of the Occupy Wall Street protests? Is it just a union front trying to shift the blame away from the White House to Wall Street, or is there something deeper there?
Well, there's real pain out there, and you have a lot of young people looking for a scapegoat. Wall Street is an intermediary. People who work on Wall Street are a lot poorer than they used to be, and they all deserve what they get. I worked on Wall Street, and I saw things there that caused me to leave. But I think the key, if you step back from the headlines and look coldly at the numbers, the problem in the United States is that the state and city governments of the United States are in danger of bankruptcy because they've made promises in terms of pensions and other benefits that add up to about $4 trillion in debt to their trade unions. And these trade unions are highly political. They are the backbone of the Democratic Party. They're the activists, the phone bank people, the get out the vote guys. That's Barack Obama's Democratic Party. They feel deeply entitled. For the states and cities to survive, they're going to have to renegotiate the lifestyle of a lot of very well-off government union workers. Otherwise, at the moment, what the states are doing is taxing property. Now, we have in the United States, as you know, a much more decentralized tax system. So state governments and city governments rely on property taxes to the point that Americans now typically pay as much in property taxes as they pay in mortgage interest. And that's one of the reasons that our property market is still underwater and the middle class is sinking. Now, so there is a... Yes, go ahead.
Well, now, Ron Paul has been taking on Wall Street from a different point of view. I mean, he thinks that we should dial back the scope of government, which I think would attack the same problem, these largely government unions. Is Ron Paul... would you say he's been vindicated by the events of the last 3 years since the recession kicked in?
I think Ron Paul tends to simplify problems. Blaming the Federal Reserve and blaming the financial institutions is really not going to, it just doesn't get us anywhere. What the financial industry did, in a nutshell, is import $6 trillion worth of foreign capital from Asia, Europe, and elsewhere to the United States between 1998 and 2007 and create a bubble. It made everyone feel a lot richer than they actually were. It inflated property values, it inflated stock prices. Once that flow stopped, Wall Street effectively went bankrupt. Property values collapsed, and a $6 trillion hole emerged in the balance sheets of American households right before the biggest retirement wave in history.
Was there any alternative to bailing out the banks? Would letting them go bankrupt, which I suppose would have been the truly free market thing to do, would that have caused an even greater credit disaster? Did we have to do the bailouts, Mr. Goldman?
Now, if we'd let the banks go under exactly when Lehman went, had the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation reorganize them and sell them back to other investors, we probably would have been in much better shape. Of course, we would have been owned by the Chinese and other foreign investors who had the cash to do that. And Americans might not have liked to have been owned by the Chinese. That's probably what will happen to the European banks. By the time we'd gotten into TARP and all these other things, early 2009, it was too late, and we kind of did have to bail them out. And the bank bailout, remember, didn't ultimately cost the government very much because they did get their money back out. So the bank bailout was not something taxpayers actually paid for. It was pretty much a revenue-neutral proposition at the end. That's not what worries me. What worries me is we have a tax burden that is killing the property market, killing the middle class, and killing small business. And we have a regulatory burden, starting with Obamacare, which has destroyed startups, which means we've got roughly 25% of the American population sitting on the sidelines, not participating in the economy, which puts, again, an enormous burden on transfer payments.
Mr. Goldman, we only have 30 seconds left. I want to ask you about your new book, and maybe you can come back on the show another time to talk about it. What's your new book? It's called How Civilizations Die. Can you give me your thesis statement in literally 30 seconds?
In 30 seconds, Islam is crashing and burning as it encounters the modern world. It's going straight from infancy to senility without passing through adulthood. And we have a civilization with 1.5 billion people going into chaos that we can't stabilize no matter how much we try to. And we've got to steel ourselves to protect ourselves from the fallout.
Huh. David Goldman, a.k.a. Spengler, one of my favorite commentators out there. We've got to have you back on because you've just opened up a whole other subject for us to talk about. Thanks for joining us today. Bye-bye. Hey.